Thanks, everyone. This is actually, I think, my first technical stop on the In Real Life tour. I was at Comic-Con, but it wasn't really the tour, and then I was in New Jersey today, but that was for the other book I've got coming out next week, Information Doesn't Want to Be Free. So you're kind of my test audience here, and this is the first time I've ever done this talk. Thank you all for coming down. Thank you, Emily, for the Strand. One of my favorite places to come when I'm in New York. I always feel like I'm on a game show. When in New York, guests of the Strand come to the Strand. So there's this slideshow that's playing back here that is not, I'm not going to try and speak to it. It's just Jen's amazing art from In Real Life. And instead I'm going to talk a bit about writing science fiction set in the near future and writing science fiction where the future catches up with you, and how I came to write this and how it relates to some wider questions I hope you'll be interested in. Oh, thanks, Gina. Wow, that's tiny. Is that how it came out? Wow, neat. So when you tell people you're a science fiction writer, it's often the case that they don't know what to say next. It's a bit like saying, you know, my job, I paint the stripes on the bees, or, you know, I'm in charge of the upkeep and maintenance on the Tooth Fairy's wand. So I can't really fault all the various people over the years who, after I said I'm a science fiction writer, then said, gosh, it must be hard writing science fiction with the future rushing up and overtaking you all the time. And though I don't fault anyone for this question, I'm still dismayed by it, because I don't ever predict anything, and I don't think science fiction writers are very good at prediction. Although a lot of them make a pretense of being predictive, I think they just suffer from delusions of grandeur. I think if you actually look at all the predictions science fiction has made over the years, it would be amazing if some of them hadn't come true, but the actual track record's very, very poor. I think of science fiction writers who laud their predictive power as being like the guy who fires a shotgun into the side of a barn and then draws a target around the place where the pellets are clustered and declares himself to be an excellent marksman. I mean, yes, some predictions came true, but, you know, if you flip a dice often and roll a dice often enough, you'll eventually get 5 sixes in a row. It doesn't mean you're good at rolling sixes. But that's not to say that science fiction isn't useful. Science fiction is useful, and it's useful in relation to the future. Since the days of Mary Shelley, science fiction writers have used the device of the futuristic parable as a diagnostic and philosophical tool for commenting on the present and how the present relates to technology. It's like when you go to the doctor and you tell her that you've got a sore throat, and she swabs the back of your throat and she touches it to a petri dish and sticks it away for the weekend, and then on Monday she pulls it out again and looks at it, and it tells her something useful and important about you, but not because she's built an accurate model of you. It's because she's built a very inaccurate model of you, a model of you in which one fact about you has become the one totalizing fact of this model of you, the one totalizing fact of the world. And science fiction writers have a similar trick. We tweeze out of the world one technology, and we project a future, not a plausible or realistic future, but a useful future in which that one fact about technology is the only fact that matters in the world. Whether it's 1984 or Foundation or contemporary works of science fiction, that's kind of your basic template for writing science fiction. And what that does is the same thing that the petri dish does for the doctor. It lets us see in relief effects that are otherwise very subtle and hard to make sense of, but that are nevertheless rippling out through our whole body, our whole society, and making changes on it and making itself felt. And that gives us a way of talking about the present, and the fact that the present is the moment at which the past becomes the future means that if you can talk about the present and how technology is changing the present, you are inevitably talking about the future. So one way to understand how that works in terms of our dialogue about the world is to imagine that it was like 1947 and World War II had just ended. And there's the peace dividend, there's sort of money sloshing around. We're trying to figure out what to do with it all as we do the reconstruction. And someone comes up and says, I've got a great idea. Now that we have all this new technology from the war effort, why don't we put cameras everywhere? We'll put cameras in everyone's bedrooms, and we'll put cameras in all the corners, and we'll put cameras just sort of everywhere. We'll watch what everyone's doing. It'll be like, you know, that moment in the Sermon on the Mount, right? His eye is on the sparrow. We will be like men as gods. And whenever anyone does anything bad, we'll know about it right away because our cameras will tell us. Won't that solve a host of social ills? And in 1947, an argument about that would be a very abstract argument. You'd be kind of like, well, it would, I don't know, wouldn't it feel creepy? But it'd be hard to kind of make concrete arguments about what's wrong with it. But in 1947, George Orwell wrote 1984, and in 1948 it was published. And by by 1949, we had a very useful word for describing what was wrong with the Cameras Everywhere program. It was Orwellian. And all of a sudden, by that one word, you could import the whole narrative of everything that was wrong with the present day ideas about how technology could be used to keep track of people. And it was prescient not because it predicted the future, but because as the future marched forward and computers became a tool of control and accounting for people and counting for people in the very smallest and most invasive ways, we could always make recourse to that narrative. An architect might build a model of a building they're thinking about, or make a fly-through that so that you can fly through it and experience what that building's going to feel like. And a science fiction writer can write about a future and fly through that future in a way that lets you talk about what it might feel like too. So that brings me to Anda's Game and In Real Life, which is its latest incarnation. In 2003, the website Slashdot had an article about a guy who'd come to a game conference, the Game Developers Conference, and who had claimed that he was paying Mexican workers on the border to play a game called EverQuest, and that they would do repetitive tasks in EverQuest until they had amassed a lot of money, and then virtual money, gold, and then that would be sold on eBay to sort of bored or time-short players in the North. And the guy who reported this, he had a reputation for being kind of a liar, and so no one was really sure if it was true, but it made a small news splash. And on the back of that, I wrote this story, Anda's Game, that Salon published in 2004, that was about a kid who plays a video game who finds herself recruited to kill these low-level players, and she doesn't know why, but she quickly discovers that they're actually gold farmers. They're people who are doing these repetitive tasks, and that the people who've hired her are rival gold farmers who want to get rid of the competition. And one of the people that she keeps encountering as she goes around killing these players, who keeps getting reincarnated, is someone who's a union organizer and who's trying to organize a trade union of gold farmers. And he kind of figures, well, these people, although they're behind these barbed wire compounds in the maquiladoras and the factory cities where trade union organizing is illegal, in the video game I can reach them and talk to them. And it's a story about her broadening out a burgeoning consciousness about justice. In the beginning of the book, she's a young girl who meets an older woman who runs this all-girl guild and who starts to think about issues of gender and justice, and her perspective broadens out to think about wider justice questions, economic justice and labor justice. And the story was really well received. And not only that, as gold farming became more and more of a story, every time there was a new story in the press about gold farming, people would tell me how prescient I'd been to invent this gold farming thing, which in fact I hadn't invented at all. So this is the easiest way to get a reputation for predicting the future, is to just predict the present. And as the present becomes the future, people will keep telling you how prescient you are. And my novel publisher is called Tor Books. They're a division of Macmillan up in the Flatiron building. And a couple of floors down is this amazing graphic novel publisher called First Second, whose books I really doted on. And so whenever I would go to Tor, I would go downstairs when I was done and cadge free comics off of First Second. And that we would always talk about whether or not I'd ever do a graphic novel for them. And I came up with this big, elaborate, super ambitious pitch for a series of graphic novels based on Anda's Game, where each one would tell a different story, set both in a different real-world country and a different virtual world. So like gold farmers in Indonesia playing, Klingon birds of prey games, organizing trade unions, that sort of thing. And they didn't like it. Instead, I ended up writing a novel based on that called For the Win that came out from Tor in 2009. But they did like Anda's Game, and they asked me if they could adapt that. So we got Jen Wang. They sent me the portfolios of a whole bunch of different artists, and Jen was head and shoulders above all of the rest of them. Was exactly the person who was drawing in exactly the way that I liked. And I was like, that's the person. And the idea was that she would write a script, and then I would edit it, and we'd collaborate on it, and then I'd look at her sketches and collaborate on it. And that's approximately what happened, except that mostly what happened is she wrote a script that was pretty much exactly perfect. And there were a few things that I disagreed with her about, most of which she was willing to give on, and a few of which were adjudicated by our editor, Callista, who sat there laughing. But approximately speaking, it was the world's most least dramatic collaboration, in that we more or less agreed, and then she did all the hard work. And now we have this book, which is terrific and arrives in a world in which 400,000 people, mostly in China, earn their living from gold farming. And workforces everywhere are following this kind of gold farming model. Workers are being further diffused. They're being made more disposable, more fungible. We thought that the outsourcing revolution would involve all of the jobs going to the Pacific Rim or South and Central America. And it turns out that outsourcing goes on and on and on and turns into things like Fiverr and TaskRabbit and the Mechanical Turk, through which people are paid almost infinitesimal sums to do semi-skilled and sometimes highly skilled jobs, and kind of bid against each other in a race to the bottom to provide the cheapest labor in the world. And that's one of the things that this book comments on. And so once again, I have a feeling that in a few years, as these issues come to a head, as the Uber driver unionization drive continues apace, that people are going to start coming up to me and telling me how prescient I was to predict all of this. Of course, all of this having been latent for all this time. And not only is this labor question becoming more urgent, but also the model of governance of games is becoming more the model of everything. So games are kind of like shopping malls or theme parks, in that you're expected to go there and kind of express yourself and do your thing and have a great time, but you should never be under any illusion that you're a citizen. You're a customer, you're on someone else's private property, they set the rules. Those rules aren't governed by a constitution, they're governed by a license agreement, effectively. And in the malls, sometimes you'll see these long lists of things, do's and don'ts. And in games, every time you log into a game, every time they do an update, you have to click a thing that says, by being dumb enough to play this game, I agree that you're allowed to come over to my house and punch my grandmother and wear my underwear and make long distance calls and eat all the food in my fridge. And that's become not just a feature of how we interact with game worlds, it's become a feature of how we interact with everything in the world, which has all become walled gardens. So whether that's your iPhone, or whether it's Facebook, or whether it's your console game, or these days your thermostat, all come with these license agreements that govern how you relate to them. And they are all designed such that there's something about them that you would like them to do that they don't do, because it's more profitable if they don't do it. So you'd like to put someone else's ink cartridges in your printer and they won't do it because it's more profitable if you have to buy their ink cartridges. Or you want to put someone else's coffee in your K-Cup and the new K-Cups won't do it because they want to make sure that you're buying their K-Cups. Or you want to load get a subprime loan on a car and drive that car wherever you want, but the leasing company has decided that you can only drive it within the Tri-County area. And so if it goes outside of that, the GPS snitches on you and it shuts itself down. And they all have this model, and the only way that model can work is if it's against the law and against the rules for you to find out how this device that has become woven into your life works. So, again, in just the same way as a mall can only enforce its rules if you're not allowed to disappear into the steam tunnels whenever the rent-a-cops show up, the iPhone model of making sure that you only buy software from Apple only works if you're not allowed to change the code, so the phone can't tell whether your software has come from Apple or from somewhere else. And this is a hell of a collision course, because the world is increasingly made out of computers. A modern house is so well insulated and so well climate controlled that without the computers that control its respiration, if you turn them off, the house is almost immediately uninhabitable. And as they discovered when they shut down the power in all those subprime houses in Florida and then left the power off for a while so that the computers weren't running anymore and governing the HVAC systems, those houses just became black mold havens and were all teardowns. So a house is just like a computer that you share space with these days. And a car is a computer that you drive at 70 miles an hour down the turnpike. And we've seen hackers demonstrate attacks where using Bluetooth, they can deactivate the brakes or control the steering of modern cars. So your car is just a computer that you're trapped inside of that drives around. A Boeing 747 is a flying Sun Solaris workstation in a very fancy aluminum case connected to some really tragically badly secured SCADA controllers. And, we fly through the air in it. And not only are we increasingly putting our bodies inside of computers, we put computers inside of our bodies. If you grew up with the iPod or the Walkman, if you live long enough to reach a certain age, if you're not felled by Ebola or a self-driving car first, then you will have logged enough punishing earbud hours that come the day you're going to get a hearing aid. And that hearing aid is vanishingly unlikely to be a beige, retro, transistorized analog device. It's going to be a computer, and you'll put it inside your body, and it will know what you hear, and it'll be able to tell other people what you hear, and it'll be able to make you hear things that aren't there, and it'll be able to make you not hear things that are there, all depending on how it's designed. And this is not science fiction. This is not predicting the future. This is predicting the present. I fly around a lot. I'm changing the climate, ask me how. And the first rule of anyone who travels a lot is ABC, always be charging. So, I was in an airport lounge, and as I always do when I get there, I checked the baseboards, and I found the lone plug, and I ran over and I plugged my laptop in to charge it before the flight. And a guy came over and, very cheekily, he said, "Can I use that plug?" And I was like, "I'm charging my laptop before the flight." And he rolled up his pants leg and showed me his prosthetic leg, robot prosthetic leg from the knee down. And he said, "I need to charge my leg before the flight." I said, obviously, it's all yours. And the problem with the model of these devices that you're not allowed to know how they work and not allowed to change how they work is that if there's a problem with how they work, if there's a flaw in how they work, then telling you about that flaw might be a thing that might allow you to change the business model. So if there's a flaw in your iPhone, a mistake that Apple's programmers made, you can bootstrap that into jailbreaking your iPhone so you can install software that Apple didn't get 30% of the sale price for. And so we have laws. We have a law here, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that makes it illegal to tell you about flaws in your iPhone. Not because Apple wants you to be attacked through your iPhone, but because Apple wants to make sure that they get their 30%. But what that means is that if there's a bug in your iPhone, or a bug in your thermostat, or a bug in your leg, or a bug in your car that would allow someone to attack you through a device that knows who all your friends are, knows all the places that you go, that has a camera and a microphone, that you take into the toilet, that you leave beside the bed, that you tell all your secrets to, that has all your passwords, if there's a flaw in that, it's against the law for you to know about it. It's against the law for people who have more nous and technical skill than you, who've discovered these subtle flaws, to publish them, because in so publishing them, they might make it possible for you to be entertained the wrong way. And that's just backwards. I mean, to think about what the future is going to look like, think about Euromaidan, those demonstrations in Ukraine. Here, our law enforcement agencies have been caught over and over again using these things called stingrays that are fake cell phone towers, and they put them down near protests, and all they do is gather the identifiers of all the cell phones at a protest so that they can figure out who is there. It's kind of like asking for your papers when you want to go out and march. It's not entirely an abridgment of your freedom to assemble, but it's pretty, it's like a first cousin of an abridgment of your freedom to assemble. And so imagine that, the next tin pot dictator of Belarus, or the last one of Ukraine, sticks one of these down in the square when everybody comes out to protest, gets all of the phone identifiers, figures out where they all live, and that night tells their smart thermostats to turn the heat off in minus 30 weather, right? The amount of power that states, criminals, cops, spy agencies, stalkers, and all kinds of other creeps and rats can arrogate to themselves in a world where our computers are designed to treat us as adversaries and to treat remote parties who send them policies as being more trustworthy and of having more authority over the function of those computers than we do, it's almost without limit. So the good news is that Ed Snowden tells us that cryptography works. And time again, we've seen that people using the internet, especially using good modern cryptography, can nimbly step around the big lumbering giants of yesteryear. That the one advantage that you have in small affinity groups who are not, who are interested in changing things, is that you can move very quickly, and cryptography lets you coordinate your efforts in ways that we've never seen before. And so, at this point, people often ask me if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the future. But being optimistic or pessimistic is really saying, do you have a prediction about the future? And I don't predict. Science fiction writers who predict the future are like drug dealers who sample their own product. It never ends well. If I felt the future was knowable, I don't know why I'd even bother getting out of bed, because if we're running on rails towards a fate that's preordained, what does any of it matter? So I don't have optimism, but what I have is something thing that I think is much better, which is hope. I think it's far more important than optimism. Hope is why, if your ship sank in the middle of an open sea, you would keep treading water until you couldn't tread water anymore. Not because you had any chance of being rescued, but because everybody who rescued treaded water for as long as they could. Most of the people who treaded water still sank, but there's no way that you can get picked up by a passing ship unless you're treading water when it gets there. And if you had a friend or a loved one who couldn't tread water, you'd hold them up and tread water twice as hard. Because the alternative is to watch as they sink. And this world is full of people and things that I love. As the tick said, don't destroy the world, that's where I keep all my stuff. And I want to fight for these things. I want to fight for a free, fair, open technology, information technology that will give us a free, fair, and open society. Because the alternative is to watch as these technologies are turned against us, turned into a more perfect kind of surveillance tool. And it's daunting, but at least it's clear. If we're going to be free, we have to seize the means of information. Computers have to be respondent to the people who own them and the people who use them, not the governments who regulate them, and not the companies that manufacture them. We know, again, a useful tool from science fiction, what happens when you use computers to boss people around instead of the other way around. It goes like this: I can't let you do that, Dave. So, not everyone can be a full-time activist. In fact, pretty much no one can be a full-time activist and work on these things. It's hard to even be a part-time activist and work on these things. But there are a lot of organizations out there that work on these issues on a rolling full-time basis with varying degrees of effectiveness and these days increasing effectiveness. And when I started thinking about this stuff, it was a very small number of groups that were involved. And these days, it's kind of metastasized all around the world because these issues have gotten more urgent. And so that's the end of my talk tonight, is to urge you to get involved with some of these groups, either just as a dues-paying member to help support their work, or in more significant ways, because they're always looking for volunteers and always looking, at the very least, for people to call their lawmakers at a critical juncture, or to call call a regulator, or to write a letter. And sometimes when enough of us do it all at once, it makes a difference. 3 million people sent comments to the FCC about net neutrality. We're still waiting to see what happens, but I have my fingers crossed. So these groups are groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, for whom I used to work. I was their European director. They're at EFF.org. Groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and the New York Civil Liberties Union. Groups like the Internet Society, which has a very active chapter here in New York. We have Jolie from ISOC back there shooting video. Hi, Jolie. Groups like Public Knowledge and Creative Commons. All of these groups are deeply involved in these issues, as well as Fight for the Future, who led the SOPA fight, Demand Progress, which was founded by Aaron Swartz, the young man who helped found Reddit and wrote the afterword to my novel, Homeland, and you'll know that he killed himself last year because he was being prosecuted for taking too many books out of the MIT library digitally, and they were going to put him in jail for 35 years to make a lesson out of him because he wrote a script to take scientific papers out of the MIT digital library instead of downloading them by hand. And this, in the view of the Massachusetts prosecutor, warranted a 35-year prison sentence. And other groups, they all need your support. They pick one, pick all of them, do something about it. Because, you know, the world is made of computers. And if we don't get the computers right, we can't have any of the other fights. If you care about gender issues, if you care about poverty, if you care about race, if you care about nuclear proliferation, if you care about public health issues, all of those fights are going to be fought on the internet, or they won't be fought at all. And without a free, fair, and open internet, we've already lost. So thank you very much. I'll answer your questions now, and then I'll deface your books. Thank you. Thank you.
I heard that I use this in my current earpiece called Count on It, soon to be released. And there's a little conversation I have on the phone, and I say, oh, by the way, Mikey, did you hear this? What's the definition of fascism? And what came out was, what I discovered was that the definition of fascism is the merging of corporate and governmental interests.
Yeah.
And the original definition was from Mussolini in 1922. The original definition was corporatism. And what I continue to do in that little, kind of mock conversation is what we have here, it seems, is it's gone further, which is that its corporate interests have overtaken government interests. And I suppose when we were talking about pessimism and optimism, I think you're right, you have to be hopeful. People that are riding the trains into the camps trying to maintain hope.
Yeah.
And but it's hard to remain hopeful in this climate. But what makes me more worried is that the level of apathy and the level of, well, what does it have to do with me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Lawrence Lessig, who's one of the fathers of the copyright reform movement, he stopped worrying about copyright reform because he would make these very persuasive evidence-based arguments that would just fall by the wayside as the entertainment industry showed up and lobbied. And he eventually concluded that the problem wasn't copyright or civil liberties or what have you. It was corruption. It was the fact that Congress basically is entirely responsive to funders. And so Larry gave up working on these other issues to just work on corruption. He started a super PAC called Mayday, and it raises money to support candidates who will abolish super PACs. So it's a lovely thing. They raised $6 million in June, and they're getting involved in 4 races in the current election, and then they're going to run a full slate in 2016. So if corruption is a thing you're interested in, that's a place to go. I mean, it's true that there's an enormous amount of apathy, and especially about technical issues, it's very hard sometimes to get people to understand it. But 3 months after Ed Snowden came in from the cold, the Pew Internet Life Project did a survey and found 87% of Americans had taken an affirmative step to protect their privacy on the internet, which is an astonishing number. And almost everything they did was useless because, there isn't a tick box on Facebook that improves your privacy. The reason Facebook has so many tick boxes on the privacy dashboard is the same reason the craps table has so many lines on it. And so you can't figure out what the hell's going on, right? But when 87% of Americans want something, it's not just activists who take notice, it's also markets that take notice. And Lessig talks about the 4 forces that move the world: markets, law, code, and norms. And when the norms shift, when people want more privacy, markets can respond. Because Silicon Valley investors are not committed to surveillance, they're committed to getting rich. And if there's a way that you can get rich by undermining Facebook, there are a group of investors who are just as happy to invest in advertising services whose principal benefit is we're not creepy like Facebook, and who are just as happy to do that as the people who funded Facebook to begin with. And so I do have some hope there. I think that there's more of this stuff happening every day. I think all the phone calls to the FCC, all the emails to the FCC about net neutrality were an amazing thing to see. I think the way that the Ferguson situation has played out in terms of staying in the news cycle, being forced into the news cycle by activists, has been incredible. I think the Hong Kong umbrella revolution has been nothing short of spectacular. School children in the streets knocking back tear gas canisters with umbrellas, wearing Burning Man goggles. Like, I could not have written that scene in a novel without being accused of self-parody, and yet there it is on the streets of Hong Kong. And so I do have some hope. And I think that in the question of network freedom, it's a task that gets easier in some ways every day, only because the internet has colonized so much of what we do that every day someone else discovers a thing about the internet that's indispensable to them, and making them understand why keeping the internet free is more than a question about whether or not jihadis are being recruited, or people are finding pornography, or people are watching movies the wrong way. It's about the nervous system of the 21st century. So when my daughter was born, I live in London, my grandmother lives in Toronto, and when my daughter was born, she very quickly figured out that if she wanted to see her great-granddaughter more than a couple of weeks a year, when we were back, she'd have to figure out video conferencing, which she duly did, because video conferencing is not rocket science. It's just not something that someone who's in your mid-80s has any particular need to do. I mean, like, if you've only got a few years left on the earth, watching progress bars is not a useful thing to do with those remaining years. But as soon as she had a good reason, she did it. And now, talking to my grandmother about network neutrality, there's a peg, right? We're not talking about an abstract issue of telecom's concentration. We're talking about whether the one phone company that will provide her with internet access in the old folks' home is going to be able to decide whether or not she can see her great-granddaughter, or whether she's going to have to pay by the minute to do it. And all of a sudden, that's an issue that she can get her teeth around. So I think that there is reason to be hopeful. I'd love to alternate genders when we do questions, if that's okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question about something that's probably a hot button issue right now, given the timing of your book release. Probably thought about that.
I know what you're going to say. Does it have a hashtag?
Yeah, it does. I mean, as a woman, and I grew up when I was 13, was when AOL became a thing, and instant messenger was a thing. I was one of the first generations to really have a life on the internet and meet people on the internet and experience both.
My AOL disk was delivered by Dinosaur.
Well, that's impressive.
Yeah.
I just came in the mail.
Right. Mine was chiseled in cuneiform on a clay tablet. Go ahead. Sorry.
And I experienced, and I'm sure that my experience is very universal, both the positive aspects of finding your internet tribes and meeting people with similar interests versus meeting people who got a little bit too much of a power rush from the internet and misrepresented themselves and held that over other people. So that brings me to #Gamergate and the harassment of women in the gaming industry. And I did get to read some of the preview pages that were posted on Tor.com before the book released. And I wonder if, based on the timing of your release and the fact that it's coinciding with all of these attacks or threats that have forced women to leave their homes, what kind of comment you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is another predicting the present thing, right? Although many people have said, how on earth did you predict that Gamergate would be going on? For those of you who don't follow this, there has been a growing and welcome feminist critique of video games that is considered and measured and quite smart and very empathic towards games, but also pointing out some of the problematic areas of it. And there is a group of just terrible men who are horrifically threatened by this and who've used as an excuse to just harass and threaten and brutalize all the women involved with this. And any woman who comes forward or opens her mouth is just turned into a target, and the women have fled their homes because of credible death threats and bomb threats, and it's dreadful. And of course, it's a no-brainer to predict that women will experience misogyny, right? It's not like this is greatly prescient. I think that, the sad news is that any quarter that a book comes out in probably has a 1 in 4 chance of coming out during some enormous shitstorm of misogyny, right? Because it's a feature of our world, right? And so what do I think of it now? I guess I think that it is dreadful, and I am amazed at the bravery of the women who stood up and continue to stand up and refuse to be silenced. I think that the debate is shifting. I think that there is that we're following the sort of Gandhian cure. First they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they win. We haven't gotten to the win part, and the fight you part can last for a long time. But the number of people who are stepping up and saying, no, this is totally right, I totally get this, from within the industry as well as the wider world, is, I think, very heartening. My wife was the first woman to play Quake on the English national team, and so I'm not the big gamer in our house. She is, and she was the publisher of games for Channel 4, and before that for the BBC, and so I live with a woman who's very involved in games, and all of her friends are awesome girl gamer, kick-ass game players who've played on teams and who've done development and work in the industry. And I think that, at that level, at the level of being a publisher, at the level of being working for the lobby group Yuki or whatever, the woman who runs Yuki, Jo Twist, is an amazing woman who's got a long history in games, and she runs the big lobbyist group for games, the big industry group in the UK. I think at that level, they are not directly harassed in the same way that women like Anita Sarkeesian are, but that all of them are keenly aware of it, and all of them are actively involved in remediating it. that there is solidarity there. And I think that sometimes, actually just had this long, really interesting, good discussion yesterday at Comic-Con with Justine Larbalastier about intersectionalism, and about whether, like, the perennial discussion about, like, whether it's all just class with and being reflected, or power being reflected in gender and race and whatever, or whether it's whether there is a thing that's different about gender struggles to other power struggles, or race struggles to power struggles, and you know, the argument against intersectionalism is that oftentimes when women get to power, they become Condoleezza Rice or Margaret Thatcher, and when black people get into the establishment, they become Barack Obama and the outgoing Attorney General and and so on. Like, basically, people who are in the establishment act like they're in the establishment regardless of their ethnic background, regardless of their gender, regardless of their gender orientation. They're all just part of the establishment. They act like it. But the games establishment, the women in the upper echelons of the games establishment, don't feel like that. They don't feel like they've swallowed the Kool-Aid. They still are keenly aware of the gender struggles in games, and I see them being very active and brave about it. And so I have hope there again. Obviously, what's going on to women like Brianna Wu, who just had to leave her house, to Laurie Penny, to other women involved in games is dreadful and inexcusable, and I don't have a remedy for it apart from being thankful that they're refusing to be silenced. Yeah. Another question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question, and it was about, and to show my age, I used to hang out on BBSs and with code freakers. You should probably do.
I know what that is. Sure.
So this is pre-web,
Right.
pre-internet stuff. And for me, there's an interesting tension between the EFF and pushing for privacy with some of the stuff that you also talk about being able to own your own equipment and do stuff with it, because there are things like when Google decided that they didn't want any facial recognition for glass. People said, no, we want facial recognition. When people put cameras everywhere because information wants to be free, especially because cameras are catching your credit card numbers, or you getting changed or whatever, it seems that there's a real cultural tension between privacy on the one hand and the information wants to be free mentality. And I want to know, I guess what I'm interested in is how you think that can best be tackled.
So I don't have I actually don't, I don't think that that's a very hard thing to cleave. I think there's a joint where that cleaves cleanly, which is transparency for the powerful and privacy for the weak. And I think that that's like, it's a really easy one to do. There are areas where you're right, there are tricky areas, like Google Glass and face recognition is a perfect example. So saying the way we're going to stop people from doing face recognition with Google Glass is by designing Google Glass so that you can't change the code, and then passing a law that says if you figure out how to change the code and tell anyone else, or we catch you doing it, we can do bad things to you. You're right that seems to come into tension with it, except that I think that if you genuinely care about whether or not people do face recognition with Google Glass, then merely saying if you break Google Glass and install face recognition will get you in trouble, won't actually stop people from doing it. It will just mean that the people who are already doing something that's probably against the law with their face recognition will be breaking another law too. And so if you care about it, you should want an effective remedy, not just a Band-Aid, right? Like there's this thing called the security syllogism. Something must be done. I've done something. Something has been done. Right? It's why we take our shoes off at airports, and the security syllogism doesn't actually make you more secure, and actually at worst it makes you feel falsely secure. So if you believe that Google's lock on Glass has solved the facial recognition problem, you live in a fool's paradise, and that's the worst thing of all, because you imagine that if you knew that your car's brakes were mushy, you would increase your following distance and drive more slowly. If you don't know that there's anything wrong with your car's brakes until you slam on them because you're going really fast and following really closely, you die, right? So knowing about the ways in which you're unsafe is actually part of how you become safe. And so assuming that everyone around you who's got Google Glass, none of them have face recognition, is a bad assumption regardless of Google's policy. And so I care about privacy, but I don't think that we get there by imagining that we have different laws of physics, or that, that we have a computer science that can make a computer that can run all the programs except for the one we don't like. That computer doesn't exist, right? All we know how to make are computers that run all the programs, or computers that can run all the programs but come with spyware on them that try to make sure you don't install any naughty programs. But those are like, that's it. That's the full catalog of modern computing, right? We have the Turing complete computer and the Turing complete computer with spyware on it. That's the lot. In fact, making environments, digital environments that can't run all the programs turns out to be transcendently hard. Like, coders keep trying to do this, right? They're like, I know, we're giving people this social media environment and we're going to let them put like animated teddy bears on it. And so we need this little scripting language so you can like determine where the teddy bear goes. It's just going to have 3 commands. And then some smartass will do a presentation at DEF CON or CCC going, I took those 3 commands and built up a Turing complete language that can run any program in it, and I wrote a virus in teddy bear description language. You know, this is a like recurring motif, right? It's like the nightmare of everyone. It turns out Magic the Gathering is Turing complete. You can build a kind of analog computer that can calculate all programs very slowly with enough Magic the Gathering decks. So so if I care about privacy and I care about Google Glass, I think that I would be more apt to regulate, to try and regulate how that information is used, and particularly in the commercial realm. And I would be more apt to regulate whether or not it's admissible into court. And I would certainly not regulate against people wearing things that try to detect CCDs. Those are the charge coupled devices that live behind cameras that can actually be detected at quite some distance, and try to countermeasure them, try to dazzle them with infrared, for example. There are lots of things that we might do to allow people to have privacy that might be effective, but just saying like, here's a thing that sort of looks like it's effective, or would be effective, but only if we assume that everyone who we care about regulating is an idiot, is not going to solve our problems. Maybe one more question, this one from a woman, if possible, so we can have gender parity. Otherwise, I'll call on a bloke. All right, Callista. You're a ringer, though.
I am a ringer. Sorry, guys. Favorite thing about working in comics? Least favorite thing about working in comics?
My favorite thing about working in comics is that you find an amazing comics creator like Jen Wang, and then she does all the hard work. My favorite thing about working in comics is that they're beautiful. You know, my novels, considered as physical objects, are of good quality. They are square and true and well glued, and have nice covers and have been thoroughly copy edited, and there are no unsightly rivers in the typesetting. Nevertheless, they don't look like that. So that's my favorite thing about working in comics. They are aesthetic. And then the other thing is they smell great. The inks in comics smell nice in a way that the inks in print books, in prose books, do not. They just, comics, I get a lot of, especially like First Second and some of the other quality trade paper publishers like Nobrow, where they're using like groovy vegetable inks and spot colors that are like made out of these exotic chemicals that I'm sure like off-gassing horrific volatile organic compounds that are taking years off my life, but they smell amazing. And so yeah, they are objects in ways that prose books aren't. My least favorite thing about working in comics, my editor is so mean. No. My least favorite thing about working in comics, I haven't found one yet. I think that like 20 years ago, I'd have said, oh, nobody takes you seriously if you make comics, but that's not true anymore. It's same with science fiction novels. Like nobody goes, oh, you write science fiction, why don't you make real literature? Like that's just totally not the case anymore. And when you hear it, it's like, it's really weird. It's like someone, cosplaying or LARPing like 19th century literary attitudes. Like it doesn't feel real. Anyway, I'm going to sit down over there with some markers and make your books non-returnable if you'd like. So thank you all very much for coming tonight.